Hello, I'm Pastor Andrew, and this is Theology Thursday. Have you ever wondered what Jesus meant when he said he would be in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights? Matthew 12:40. Are we to understand this literally, as in 3 full 24-hour periods with 3 sunrises and 3 sunsets? Or is there some other way? If Jesus was crucified on Friday, there isn't 3 sunrises and sunsets to Sunday morning, when they went to the tomb and found it empty. What's going on here? Today we'll examine this in Theology Thursday. Thanks for joining me. To understand this, we have to look at language. Remember that primarily the scriptures were written in Hebrew for the Old Testament and Greek for the New, with some Aramaic parts. Now, every language has certain and unique expressions. These are idioms that, if you're not familiar with the language, in other words, if it's not your native language, words can sometimes be hard to understand. These expressions can be difficult to comprehend. Take, for example, our saying of kick the bucket. What does that mean? It's an idiom. It means the individual died. Or, hey, it's a piece of cake. What does that mean? Well, it means it's easy. But talk to somebody whose primary language is not English, and these idioms can be very confusing, if downright difficult to grasp. These idioms only make sense to native speakers or to someone who has studied the language thoroughly and understands its nuance. The same applies, if you will, to the expressions concerning time. For example, if I were to text my wife right now at this point and say, I'll be home in a couple minutes, then I walk in the door 30 to 45 minutes later, will she be surprised? No, of course not. She won't ask me, why wasn't I home in 2 minutes? Exactly 2 minutes. Why not? Because she understands that my statement of I'll be home in a couple of minutes is an idiom. It means soon. I'm in transit. I'll be there shortly. Similarly, let's maybe consider that I have been working outside all day, and I tell my son around 6 o'clock, hey, let's call it a day. Now, he won't say, but hey, Dad, how can we stop? It hasn't been a full 24 hours yet. It's not a day. We understand that the expression, call it a day, means let's stop working. Let's stop doing what we're doing right now and go on to something else, even though a partial period of time has passed. As it is within our English, so it is within the Hebrew. Hebrew has thousands of these sorts of expressions. Many of them are quite unique, and some are downright colorful. For instance, in the Hebrew, it describes God's language as in the Hebrew language, it describes God's patience as having a long nose. It literally says he has a long nose. Picture that, if you will, God with a long nose as an idiom for patience. There's many sorts of expressions in the Hebrew language, and depending on the context, it kind of means different things. The Hebrew has an expression which, roughly translated in regards to time, would say yesterday, 3 days. And depending on how it's used, it can mean yesterday or previously, as in sometime in the past. It does not mean a literal 72-hour period. It just means sometime before today. Likewise, a Hebrew expression, the third day, or third day as we would translate it, does not necessarily mean a literal third day. For instance, look at Hosea chapter 6, verse 2. Here the prophet says, after 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will rise us up that we may live before him. He is talking about a future event in which God will bring Israel home to himself. Not something he will do after 48 hours has elapsed. Hosea is reflecting a common tradition in the Old Testament of significant events happening on the third day. For instance, Abraham and Isaac reached Moriah on the third day, Genesis 22:4. God descended onto Sinai on the third day, Exodus 19:11. And Jonah was in the fish 3 days and 3 nights, Jonah 1:17. This tradition of God doing something big on the third day was, by the way, probably what St. Paul was referring to when he said that Christ was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, 1 Corinthians 15:4. He wasn't referring to a specific proof text, but to this grouping of events that all had a prophetic message implied. If we take a look at the book of Esther, we can see that the phrase after 3 days can mean on the third day. Interesting. As preparation for her appearance before the king, Esther asked her fellow Jews not to eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. Esther 4:16. On the surface, this would suggest that after this 3-day period, on the 4th day, Esther would go to the king. But no, the scriptures tell us in Esther 5, chapter 5, verse 1, on the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and entered the king's presence. Thus, after 3 days is an idiom that meant on the 3rd day. This way of speaking was continued in later Jewish writings, such as the Talmud, where Jewish scholars discuss days and partial days. For the rabbis of that time, for the teachers of that time, a part of a day was also equal to the whole day. So 1 minute of a 24-hour period is the equivalent of a day when referencing, if you will, an idiom. So regarding the day and night phraseology, this just means 1 day or even a part of that day. It's similar to English when we say, I've been working day and night to get this Theology Thursday done. Of course, that doesn't mean that I've been working a literal 24-hour period. Rather, I've been putting time into the preparation. Long hours, if you will, during Holy Week. In Hebrew, therefore, 3 days and 3 nights need not consist of 3 full 24-hour periods. 3 partial days will suffice. It's not much different in English. When someone says, I'll get back with you within 3 or 4 days, if they then to respond to you within 2 days or 5 days, we're not surprised. We all know that 3 or 4 days is not to be taken literally. It just means soon. Now, all of this information, as much as it is vital for us to understand what Jesus says in Matthew 12:40. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. If we were to understand this literally as English speakers, then Jesus would not have been raised on the 3rd day, but on the 4th day, after the supposed 72-hour time period had passed, not a minute before, not a minute after. But as we saw with Esther, after 3 days simply means on the 3rd day. In short, Jesus is Jewish. He was thinking and speaking as a typical Hebrew would in the language that was used of the day. So there's no contradiction, as is sometimes pointed out, between the traditional understanding of Jesus' time in the grave and the 3 days and 3 nights in Matthew 12. We must keep in mind that every language uses certain expressions about time that when taken literally can be misunderstood. Now, whatever language Jesus may have been speaking, probably Hebrew, maybe Aramaic, but most likely Hebrew, his mind and expressions were shaped by the Hebrew language and their mode of expression. He wasn't speaking as a English speaker in the United States would be in 2023, but rather as someone living in the 1st century. So when we read the scriptures, we must adapt our thoughts, our understandings, our teachings, our expressions to that context, to that language and that culture to understand. And when we do this, when we understand the Hebrew, when we understand the context, when we understand idioms, we realize that the partial days of Good Friday, all of Saturday, and a part of Sunday are indeed 3 days and 3 nights in the Hebrew. God bless you this Holy Week. God's peace. We'll see you next week on Theology Thursday.